The Children didn't arrive as a typical low-budget shock film. It emerged like a chemical warning disguised as small-town horror, born from an era terrified of toxins leaking into everyday life. The production stumbled forward with a story no one wanted responsibility for and a cast too young to recognize the darkness surrounding them. Scenes shifted overnight, tempers flared, and the line between artistic intent and sheer survival blurred. Why did this film insist on confronting the one taboo Hollywood avoided? And how did such a fragile creation endure long enough to become a cult relic? These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about. The Children. Fact 1. The concept everyone tried to avoid. The origin of The Children began as a pitch that drifted from office to office like a problem no one wanted to claim. Producers in the independent New York circuit reacted with the same expression, curiosity, followed by unease. A story about children transformed into lethal carriers by a toxic cloud struck many as too volatile for the time, not because audiences lacked appetite for danger, but because the premise tampered with cultural absolutes. Children were symbols of innocence, future, continuity. Turning them into agents of death felt to many executives like violating an unwritten rule, yet the idea was rooted in genuine societal fear. Headlines in the late 1970 seconds described chemical leaks, carcinogenic waste sites, and towns discovering that their soil, water, and lungs had already been compromised. The screenwriters argued that horror should reflect the moment's paranoia, and nothing captured that climate better than the notion of environmental damage corrupting the very people meant to outlive us. Resistance, however, remained fierce. One early financier withdrew entirely after reading only half the script, claiming the filmmakers were inviting outrage for no artistic gain. Another proposed reframing the children as extraterrestrials to soften the moral blow. The creative team refused, insisting the terror depended on the contamination being man-made. Even crew members who later joined the project confessed they initially hoped to be offered something else. But something in the taboo energized the small production. They believed the story's discomfort was precisely why it needed to be told. Instead of retreating, they leaned harder into the premise. Ironically, the very quality that terrified studios became the film's quiet advantage, its refusal to dilute its theme. And by embracing a concept most filmmakers ran from, The Children established itself not as a shock piece, but as a grim reflection of a country grappling with the consequences of its own negligence. Fact 2. A crew held together by improvised survival. When filming finally commenced in rural Massachusetts, the production resembled a rescue effort more than a functioning movie set. The budget dictated everything, borrowed lighting units that flickered unpredictably, a camera package assembled from mismatched components, and a grip team forced to repair equipment with hardware store scraps. Scenes were written not based on narrative ambition, but on what the crew could physically accomplish on a given day. Winter storms rolled in without warning, freezing cables, collapsing reflectors, and turning exterior locations into treacherous terrain. Cast members shivered through takes while the director attempted to salvage continuity from weather patterns that changed within minutes. Some actors wore the same wardrobe pieces for days because replacements didn't exist. Even the production vehicles stalled in the cold, often requiring half the crew to push them into position. But amid the frayed nerves and dwindling daylight, something unexpected formed. A collective determination that bordered on stubbornness. When the only working lens began distorting images, the cinematographer redesigned entire sequences around its flaw rather than waste time seeking alternatives. When a location withdrew permission, the team improvised a new blocking pattern inside an abandoned building that wasn't on the schedule. These last-minute pivots created a visual language of instability, one that mirrored the film's narrative disintegration. Crew members later remarked that the environment shaped the movie in ways no storyboard ever could. The pervasive sense of cold, fatigue, and uncertainty seeped into the footage, giving scenes a tremor of authenticity. In retrospect, the film's low-budget struggles weren't obstacles but essential ingredients. The production survived because the people making it refused to let the chaos define to them. Instead, they transformed it into tone, atmosphere, and texture. What viewers interpret as deliberate unease was, in truth, the imprint of a team forced to invent their own survival techniques for every frame they captured. Fact 3. The children who performed without knowing the horror. Working with child actors demands delicacy, but the children required an even stranger balance, guiding performances without revealing the true nature of the story. To avoid traumatizing the young cast, producers distributed edited script pages, explaining only that the children were acting unusually because of a mysterious event. The actors complied, unaware their scenes would later be paired with visual effects, transforming ordinary gestures into lethal attacks. The disconnect produced uncanny results. During rehearsals, the children often giggled at their own slow, synchronized movements, thinking they resembled superheroes or dreamwalkers. Crew members played along, encouraging them to imagine they were drifting through fog or listening to something far away. The innocence of their interpretation clashed sharply with the grim panic of the adult actors who were fully briefed on the film's tone. One actress recalled performing a death scene while her young co-star asked afterward if she liked pretending to nap with her eyes open. Parents hovered anxiously around the set, some demanding updates on how their children's footage would be edited. A few grew angry after glimpsing storyboards depicting charred victims. Feeling misled about the film's intensity, the director held multiple meetings to reassure families, emphasizing that no child would witness any frightening imagery during production. Even so, tensions remained. The strange irony is that the children's lack of awareness became the movie's greatest asset. Because they weren't playing monsters, their performances carried no theatrics, no contrived menace, just the eerie neutrality of kids following instructions they didn't fully grasp. When paired with adults reacting in terror, the contrast produced a chilling emotional dissonance. The children moved gently, innocently. The world around them collapsed in fear. Their unintentional calm became the film's most disturbing feature. They were not performing horror. They were simply being children in a narrative designed to weaponize innocence, and that made every frame profoundly unsettling. Fact 4. The shot that frightened the crew before anyone else. The eeriest moment in The Children didn't come from the script, but from an accident during early lighting tests. A simple blocking setup placed one young actor in a doorway with a faint, off-colored backlight behind them. The intention was to create a hint of unease, nothing more, but as soon as the camera rolled, something about the silhouette unsettled the entire crew. The child's outline stretched unnaturally across the wall, elongated as if another figure were layered inside their shadow. Even the director, who normally dismissed such anxieties, paused mid-sentence to study the playback. The distortion seemed to shift independently of the actors' movements, creating the illusion of a second presence lingering behind them. Crew members whispered about malfunctioning bulbs or warped gel filters. The lighting specialist eventually discovered the root of the phenomenon, a heat-damaged diffusion sheet fluttering subtly, redirecting beams of light with unpredictable angles. The explanation calmed no one. Instead, the crew leaned into the effect, amplifying the strange distortion rather than correcting it. The director reshot the scene with minimal guidance, allowing the child to stand motionless while the light performed its eerie choreography. Later, when reviewing the footage, editors enhanced the moment by allowing the shadow to dominate the frame for several lingering beats. What had begun as a technical flaw evolved into one of the film's most psychologically disturbing images, a subtle indication that reality within the story was bending in ways the characters couldn't perceive. Ironically, audiences later praised the visual as deliberate stylistic intent. Even scholars wrote analyses describing the shadow as metaphor for corrupted innocence. In truth, the crew's discomfort was genuine, born from the uncanny recognition that accidents sometimes reveal deeper horror than design. The shot terrified them before it ever reached the screen, and that authentic unease is what audiences still respond to decades later. Fact 5. The effect that should have failed but became iconic. The infamous burning touch that defines The Children was never intended to be convincing. With the effects budget nearly depleted before shooting began, the team created the sequence using a patchwork of outdated techniques, frame-by-frame overexposure, hand-painted streaks on negatives, and smoke textures pulled from unrelated stock footage. Even the effects supervisor admitted privately that he expected the result to resemble a cheap photocopy malfunctions rather than a lethal chemical reaction. Yet when the first composite reel screened, the room fell silent. The chaotic layering produced a jittery, corrosive flicker unlike anything the crew anticipated. Instead of clean lines or predictable glow, the effect clung to actors' silhouettes with uneven, violent motion, as though the toxin were alive and consuming them from the inside out. The randomness gave the death scenes a disturbing realism, less supernatural spectacle, more industrial catastrophe. Actors performing the sequences had no visual reference, so their exaggerated spasms accidentally aligned with the erratic overlays, intensifying the sense of a breakdown occurring beneath the skin. Editors embraced the imperfections, refusing to stabilize frames or smooth transitions. They discovered that slight delays between exposure layers created a haunting afterimage, prompting viewers to see shapes that weren't there. Audiences, convinced the production had used hidden pyrotechnics, left screenings with the impression that the film contained more violence than it actually showed. Critics described the effect as intimately horrifying, though none realized the look was the product of necessity rather than ambition. The effect's crude origins eventually became part of its mystique. In modern restorations, colorists intentionally preserved the flicker because removing it diluted the film's menace. What should have been the production's greatest weakness became its most unforgettable signature. The burning touch didn't succeed because the filmmakers mastered their tools. It succeeded because the tools broke in precisely the right way. Fact 6. The parents whose outrage nearly stopped filming. The tension surrounding the children didn't come only from the story, it came from the real parents of the young cast. At the start of production, they were reassured that the film avoided explicit violence and focused more on mood than shock. But as shooting progressed, families noticed inconsistencies. Adults rehearsing panicked collapses, charred props tucked in corners, and hushed conversations about scenes scheduled for late nights. Suspicion escalated after one child actor innocently described practicing a touch that makes people fall over. A group of parents demanded a meeting, arriving with printouts of storyboards they found in a production office. The drawings, depicting scorched victims and frantic chases, contradicted what they had been told. Some parents threatened to remove their children, others insisted on rewritten material. The director attempted transparency, demonstrating how effects would be added in post and emphasizing that the children would never witness frightening imagery. But the fear wasn't logistical, it was moral. Several parents questioned whether the film's premise crossed a line, arguing that children portraying killers, even unknowingly, could be emotionally damaging. Lawyers became involved, and for days the production teetered on collapse. In response, producers created new oversight protocols, including mandatory on-set child advocates and restricted shooting windows. Though tensions eased, mistrust lingered. Ironically, the outcry shaped the film's creative identity. Because explicit violence became too contentious to stage, the director leaned into suggestion and implication, relying on angles, lighting, and reaction shots to convey fear. The children performed in a bubble of innocence, unaware of the terror their characters represented. Years later, several parents admitted they regretted their initial anger, proud that their children had participated in a film that achieved cult status. But at the time, the dispute nearly ended production. The movie survived only because compromise forced the filmmakers to craft horror not through spectacle, but through restraint, a choice that ultimately made the story more unsettling. Fact 7. The town that welcomed, the crew then wanted, them gone. At first, the Massachusetts town chosen for the children felt like an ideal match. Quiet streets, cooperative officials, and locals intrigued by the idea of hosting a film production, but their enthusiasm dissolved almost immediately once the plot became widely understood. Word spread that the movie centered on children transformed into killers by toxic exposure, and the tone of the community shifted. Parents complained the film portrayed youth as inherently corrupted. Clergy members spoke against it during sermons, arguing that the premise profited from moral panic. Business owners who had initially offered their storefronts began withdrawing permission, worried their establishments would be associated with something spiritually unwholesome. Matters worsened when smoke tests for a contamination scene triggered a misunderstanding. Residents saw the haze drifting through a closed-off street and believed a real chemical accident had occurred. Emergency services arrived, expecting a hazardous spill, only to discover a film crew quietly adjusting a fog machine. The incident embarrassed town officials, who then pressured the filmmakers to scale back operations. Some privately suggested leaving altogether. With locations disappearing and locals refusing to cooperate, the production adapted through necessity, shooting in abandoned lots, private backyards, and any property owned by sympathetic residents. To the director's surprise, the forced isolation improved the film's atmosphere. Empty spaces and reluctant hosts created a palpable tension that seeped into the visuals. Scenes that were meant to look bustling became stark and desolate, mirroring the townspeople's growing hostility. When the movie finally released, the town publicly distanced itself from the project. But as the film gained cult status, horror fans began visiting, photographing familiar backdrops, and sparking new conversations among residents. Some regretted their earlier objections, others still felt the production violated their community's identity. The irony is impossible to miss. A town afraid of being portrayed as contaminated became forever linked to a film about contamination in ways they never intended. Fact 8. The director who stayed long after he wanted to leave. The director of The Children began the project with pragmatic intentions. He needed work, and the production needed someone willing to manage a script burdened by controversy. Within weeks, however, he found himself emotionally entangled in ways he never predicted. Budget shortages forced him into constant improvisation. Safety concerns generated conflict with producers, and the strain of directing minors under strict guidelines drained morale. At one point, he attempted to step away entirely, citing exhaustion and artistic frustration, but contractual obligations and the crew's pleas pulled him back. Something about the film's core idea kept tightening its grip on him. The notion that everyday life can fracture without warning, that innocence can collapse not by choice but by exposure. Colleagues noticed his behavior shifting. He rewrote scenes moments before filming, slashing dialogue until only silence remained. He experimented with unusual camera perspectives, often framing adults from low angles to make them appear vulnerable beneath the children's calm. Indifference. He encouraged actors to wander freely through a scene, waiting for moments of genuine uncertainty rather than rehearsed fear. The crew described him as both deeply focused and deeply fatigued, a man wrestling with material that unsettled him even as he shaped it. His intensity resulted in striking images, but it also isolated him. He stopped going home at night, sleeping in corners of the set with notebooks full of scribbled ideas he never explained. When shooting wrapped, he vanished from the industry for a period, later admitting that the film had taken more than it returned. But with distance, he came to recognize that the movie's unsettling tone, its hesitations, its fractured pacing, its quiet dread reflected his inner conflict. He stayed because something inside him needed to finish the story, even when he wanted to flee it. And that lingering tension is what gives the film its strange, haunting pulse. Fact 9. The prop, the crew, treated like toxic waste. Among the film's practical effects, one prop gained a reputation that surpassed anything shown on screen: the scorched mannequin used to represent an adult victim reduced by the children's lethal touch. The effects team built it from mismatched materials, melted latex, warped rubber, frayed clothing, and pieces of a deteriorating CPR dummy. Because the workshop was poorly heated, the adhesives cured unpredictably, causing the mannequin to sag and collapse in bizarre patterns. By the time it reached set, the prop looked disturbingly lifelike, as if a real body had undergone chemical decay. Cast members recoiled when they saw it. One performer refused to rehearse near it, convinced it was unsafe. Even seasoned crew avoided touching it barehanded, not because they feared contamination, but because the mannequin seemed to exude an aura of something genuinely wrong. Matters worsened when studio lights activated its hidden flaw. Under prolonged heat, the materials released a noxious odor that permeated the set. Ventilation efforts failed, and several crew members reported lightheadedness. The effects team insisted the fumes were harmless, though their uncertainty did little to reassure anyone. As a result, production assistants transported the prop shrouded in heavy canvas, treating it as if it were hazardous cargo. Despite its grotesque presence, the mannequin played a crucial narrative role. The director realized that showing only fragments an arm, a slumped torso, a burned outline was more effective than revealing the entire figure. Viewers filled the gaps with their own imagination, amplifying the horror. After filming ended, no one volunteered to take the prop home or store it. According to crew legend, it was abandoned in a shed behind the production office, door sealed, lights off, left to decompose in silence. Fittingly, the prop designed to embody contamination became contaminated by myth, remembered less as a piece of rubber and more as an artifact no one wished to claim. Fact 10. The distorted lens that became the film's unintended signature. The most unsettling images in The Children weren't crafted through intentional artistry, but through a damaged lens the production couldn't afford to replace. During early takes, the cinematographer noticed the edges of the frame bowing inward, warping straight lines into unnatural curves. Actors seemed to stretch slightly when they moved too close, as though reality thinned in their presence. Technically, the lens should have been discarded, yet the crew had no alternatives. With deadlines mounting, they continued shooting, assuming the distortion would be minimized in editing. But when the footage played back, something remarkable happened. The warped perspective gave the children an uncanny aura, subtly bending the world around them. The visual shift echoed the film's themes of contamination, ordinary environments appearing corrupted without explanation. Instead of avoiding the defect, the director embraced it, placing the lens on scenes that hinted at escalating danger. Adult characters seemed smaller, more fragile. As the frame tightened and curved around them, the children, by contrast, appeared strangely grounded, untouched by the visual instability. Editors later enhanced the effect by arranging these distorted shots at moments where tension simmered. Critics praised the resulting aesthetic as deliberate experimentation, unaware it began as a budget-compelled compromise. The lens, worn and imperfect, became the film's accidental storyteller, and when archivists attempted to recreate the distortion for restoration decades later, they found it impossible to replicate precisely. Whatever flaw lived inside that piece of glass existed only for those few weeks of filming, an artifact of circumstance that shaped the movie's identity in ways no one could have predicted. Fact 11. The makeup artists who worked in shadows and silence. The makeup team responsible for The Children operated under conditions few productions would accept today. With funding stretched thin, their workspace wasn't a proper effects studio, but an unheated outbuilding where drafts slipped through cracked boards and supplies froze overnight. They worked mostly at dawn or after dark, when power was diverted from lighting rigs, leaving them to assemble prosthetics by lantern glow. Latex reacted unpredictably in the cold, stiffening too fast or tearing mid-application. Instead of discarding ruined pieces, the team repurposed them, turning collapsed molds into burned textures and shredded fragments into glimpses of scorched fabric. The goal wasn't realism through detail, but realism through implication. Because children couldn't be exposed to disturbing imagery, most effects were designed for adult stand-ins. Clever framing disguised the substitutions. A shoulder-crossing frame, a sleeve smoldering, a hand trembling near the edge of visibility. This required the makeup artists to create prosthetics that read clearly under dim lighting without appearing theatrical. Their greatest challenge came from time. Scenes rewritten on set forced them to improvise new wounds or altered silhouettes within minutes. They became experts at fast, resourceful invention, sculpting horror under pressure. Despite their essential role, they remained nearly invisible to the rest of the crew, stepping onto set only when called, then vanishing back into the darkness of their workshop. Yet their handiwork shaped the film's tone more than any other department. Viewers believed they saw graphic violence. Though almost none existed, the makeup team's subtle distortions allowed the audience's imagination to do the heavy lifting. In the end, their work demonstrated a truth often forgotten in horror filmmaking. The most disturbing images are the ones only half shown, born from shadows, silence, and the limitations that force creativity into unexpected territory. Fact 12. The mysterious sound no one planned to record. One of the film's defining features is the faint, high-frequency tone that trails behind the children like an invisible warning. Audiences assumed it was an intentional post-production element designed to mimic electromagnetic interference. But during shooting, the sound department discovered the tone wasn't artificial at all. It had been captured accidentally. The anomaly appeared only when multiple children were in frame, leading technicians to suspect faulty cabling or ambient machinery. They swapped microphones, relocated equipment, rewired power sources, and even shut down generators. Yet, the pitch persisted. It hovered at the edge of hearing, unsettling without becoming fully identifiable. Initially, the team intended to remove the noise entirely, but when the director heard it in context, he realized it added a layer of disorientation the film desperately needed. The hum blurred the boundary between natural and unnatural, suggesting that the contamination altered not only the children, but the world's very frequencies. Sound designers experimented with replicating the tone, attempting digital recreations and analog synths, yet none matched the organic irregularity of the original recordings. The decision was made to preserve the accidental hum and even extend it subtly into scenes where dread simmered beneath the surface. Engineers later theorized the sound might have come from distant industrial equipment or resonating electrical lines. A few crew members joked that the frequency appeared only when the story demanded it, treating the anomaly like an omen, whatever its source. The tone became inseparable from the film's atmosphere, an audio ghost embedded in the footage. Its presence reminds viewers that some of the most haunting elements in cinema arise not from design, but from accidents that refuse to be ignored. Fact 13. The yellow hue that became a visual warning. The yellow haze that coats the children wasn't a stylistic flourish conceived during pre-production. It emerged as an accidental side effect of filming in harsh winter conditions. The crew first noticed the discoloration during daily rushes. Outdoor scenes appeared washed in a sickly tone, as if the air itself carried traces of chemical residue. Initially, the cinematographer feared that the film stock had been improperly stored, or worse, expired. Lab technicians confirmed that a specific batch of stock tended to shift toward yellow when exposed to reflective snow under cold temperatures. The news should have prompted reshoots, but the production lacked both money and time. Instead of fighting the defect, the director studied the footage and realized the tint radiated exactly the type of unease the story demanded. The landscape looked subtly contaminated, polluted not by visible smoke or debris, but by an atmosphere turned toxic. The creative team leaned into the imperfection, adjusting lighting setups to exaggerate the tonal shift in scenes involving the children. Interiors adopted warmer hues to contrast the outdoor sequences, amplifying the sense that something outside had fundamentally changed. The tint became an unseen antagonist, a visual metaphor for environmental corruption silently spreading through the town. Critics later praised the film's radioactive palette, assuming it reflected deliberate artistic intent. Restoration crews decades afterward faced an unusual dilemma: correct the discoloration and risk erasing the film's character, or preserve the flaw as an integral part of its identity. Ultimately, they chose preservation. The yellow cast had become synonymous with the movie's mood, a warning signal woven directly into the image. What began as a technical inconvenience evolved into the aesthetic heartbeat of the children, reinforcing the unsettling idea that contamination leaves marks long before anyone realizes they're breathing it in. Fact 14. The patrol car that became an unscripted character. One pivotal moment in The Children required the sheriff's patrol car to roar to life instantly, underscoring the urgency of his desperate attempt to reach the contaminated zone. But the aging vehicle, borrowed from a local source, had its own agenda. From the first take, the engine sputtered and died. Refusing to cooperate with the timing the scene demanded, mechanics cycled through every basic repair: new plugs, cleaned carburetor, rewired ignition, yet the problem persisted unpredictably. Each failed attempt cost precious daylight, leaving actors huddled against the cold while the crew tried coaxing the car back to functionality. When a nearly perfect take collapsed the moment the sheriff turned the key, the director made a spontaneous decision. Instead of resetting, he instructed the actor to build frustration into the performance. The sheriff pounded the steering wheel, twisted the key repeatedly, and muttered under his breath until the engine finally caught. The unplanned struggle injected a raw, human desperation into the scene, conveying the character's helplessness more effectively than the scripted version. Later takes produced inconsistent results. Sometimes the engine roared immediately, other times it failed altogether, forcing editors to stitch together audio that matched the emotional rhythm rather than mechanical accuracy. Surprisingly, audiences praised the realism of the moment. They recognized the sheriff as a man fighting not only an external threat, but the unreliability of the tools meant to protect him. The car transformed from a prop into a character, an embodiment of failing infrastructure and eroding trust. In the final cut, the flawed engine didn't just propel the scene, it echoed the film's broader theme. When systems collapse, panic fills the void. The patrol car's obstinance became a tiny but powerful reminder that even the everyday machinery of life can betray you at the moment you most depend on it. Fact 15. The editor who rebuilt the film from a cramped sanctuary, cutting The Children into a coherent narrative, fell to an editor who worked not in a studio, but in a converted storage closet tucked inside a rented facility. The room was barely wide enough to accommodate an editing desk and stacks of film canisters piled ceiling high. Without proper ventilation, chemical fumes from the aging stock gathered in the air, giving the space a claustrophobic, dreamlike quality. Yet this limitation became the unlikely catalyst for the film's haunting rhythm. As the editor sifted through scenes, he discovered a pattern. Moments intended as transitional carried a subtle dread when allowed to linger, while reaction shots became more powerful when isolated from their surrounding dialogue. The confined environment heightened his sensitivity to pauses, breaths, and silence. He began shaping the film not around action, but around the spaces between it. Occasionally, mislabeled reels landed out of sequence, producing uncanny juxtapositions, children appearing just before or after scenes where they weren't meant to be present, creating ghost-like echoes of their influence. Rather than discard these accidents, he refined them, weaving suggestion into the film's structure, ambient noises seeping through the closet walls, distant machinery, hums, and muffled footsteps became raw material for sound layering. He blended these textures subtly into certain scenes, deepening the sensation that contamination had seeped into everyday environments. When the rough cut screened for the crew, its tension surprised even the director. What had been fragmented, uncertain footage now carried a suffocating coherence. The editor had transformed practical constraints into aesthetic choices, building an atmosphere that felt both deliberate and disquieting. The film's identity, its fractured pacing, lingering dread, and sense of environmental pressure originated not on set, but in that cramped sanctuary. Sometimes the smallest rooms forge the biggest impact, especially when the story itself thrives on claustrophobia, uncertainty, and the feeling that something toxic is closing in. Fact 16. The legal dispute that erased the film from its own history. Soon after The Children completed its modest theatrical run, it began slipping into an unexpected void. Theater owners reported that distribution agreements were suddenly withdrawn, and television programmers could no longer secure broadcast rights. Fans assumed the backlash over its unsettling premise had triggered organized censorship. Letters from community groups, particularly parent organizations, had criticized the film for portraying children as vessels of corruption. Yet political outrage was only a surface distraction. Behind the scenes, a tangled conflict over ownership rights was unfolding. Multiple parties claimed partial control over international distribution, each citing contracts riddled with contradictory clauses. When negotiations collapsed, no distributor dared touch the film, fearing lawsuits. As a result, The Children drifted into a strange limbo, too legally risky to release, yet too culturally notorious to disappear entirely. The scarcity fueled fascination. Bootleg copies circulated at conventions, often several generations removed from the original print, their degraded visuals intensifying the movie's eerie aura. Fans debated whether the film had been intentionally buried. Some speculated that environmental lobbyists had pressured distributors. Others believed chemical companies disliked the film's ecological undertones. But the truth was far less conspiratorial and far more bureaucratic. Once the contracts were disputed, no one had authority to authorize reprints. It took years before the legal knots unraveled, and the film resurfaced on home video. By then, the myth of its disappearance had become inseparable from its identity. Ironically, the legal paralysis that nearly erased the movie also preserved its mystique. It re-emerged not as a forgotten oddity, but as a relic that seemed too dangerous or too inconvenient to remain accessible. In a fitting twist, the contamination in the story echoed the contamination in its rights: complex, elusive, and capable of spreading chaos long after the initial incident. Fact 17. The reviewer who declared the film a moral hazard. Among the film's early critics, none made a more dramatic impact than a respected East Coast reviewer who condemned The Children as a moral hazard disguised as entertainment. His column, written after a poorly attended matinee, was less a review and more a warning. He argued that the film destabilized fundamental societal narratives by transforming children's symbols of purity into silent agents of destruction. To him, the psychological threat outweighed any fictional one. He claimed that the movie exploited parental fears during a period rife with anxiety over industrial pollution and government failures. What unsettled him most was the absence of comforting structure. No authoritative scientist arrives with answers. No moral voice restores order. No explanation redeems the chaos. Instead, the film ends with the terrifying suggestion that the cycle may begin again. His critique sparked immediate debate. Some readers accused him of overreacting, while others agreed the film trespassed ethical boundaries. Theaters grew wary. A few pulled the film preemptively, not for financial reasons, but to avoid controversy. Ironically, the reviewers' outrage created a magnetism around the picture. Curious audiences sought screenings specifically because someone had declared it dangerous. College film clubs, always eager to explore taboo works, adopted it as a point of discussion. Horror publications reprinted excerpts of the review, framing it as evidence of the film's audacity. Scholars later revisited the critic's claims, noting that his objections revealed more about cultural anxieties than the movie itself. As environmental fears escalated during the early 1980 seconds, tales of corrupted youth reflected deeper unease about societal neglect. The reviewer had tried to silence the movie but inadvertently ensured its survival. His condemnation became part of its legend, proof that provocation sometimes speaks louder than praise. Fact 18. The letters that turned criticism into something more personal. As word of the children spread, the director began receiving letters that moved beyond artistic critique into deeply personal territory. Early notes expressed disappointment or concern, often from parents who felt the film crossed moral boundaries. But soon the tone changed. Anonymous envelopes arrived containing cryptic warnings. "You've awakened something you can't control," one read. Another simply declared, "Children should never be portrayed this way." The ambiguity made them more disturbing. Some letters included clippings about real industrial accidents or environmental scandals, as if accusing the film of exploiting genuine suffering. Others framed their anger in almost ritualistic language, suggesting the movie had violated a sacred cultural rule. The director initially dismissed the messages as emotional responses to provocative material, but when one delivery contained ash and a scorched photograph of a playground, he contacted authorities. Investigators found no concrete threat, yet the psychological effect lingered. Crew members noticed he became withdrawn during interviews, avoiding questions about moral implications or symbolism. He confided to colleagues that he feared the outrage stemmed not from the film's imagery, but from its metaphor, the idea that society could inadvertently corrupt its own children through neglect or environmental carelessness. Over time, the letters became less frequent, replaced by fan mail from horror enthusiasts who admired the film's daring. But the early flood left a mark. The director later admitted that the reactions revealed something he hadn't fully considered. The boundary between fiction and cultural fear is fragile. When a film challenges cherished archetypes, audiences may respond with a volatility that has little to do with the movie itself. The letters were not threats to his safety, but reminders that stories can provoke emotions people struggle to articulate, and in the unsettling world of the children, those unspoken fears were always the point. Fact 19. The ending that refused to offer comfort. The final moments of The Children have perplexed audiences since the film's release, not because of dramatic spectacle, but because of the unsettling restraint with which the story concludes. The script originally contained a detailed explanation linking the toxic cloud to neurological breakdown, offering viewers a scientific anchor. But during post-production, the director began dismantling this clarity. Almost every explanatory line was removed, leaving behind an ending governed by implication rather than certainty. What remained was a chilling suggestion. The infection had not ended but merely shifted, continuing its quiet spread into the next generation. The final image, a newborn exhibiting subtle signs of contamination, was not meant to tease a sequel, but to provoke unease by denying closure. Audiences leaving early screenings responded with confusion or frustration. Some believed footage was missing. Others assumed the abrupt ambiguity resulted from studio interference. Scholars later embraced the ending as a reflection of cultural anxiety surrounding environmental negligence. The idea that contamination could be inherited, passed down despite efforts to contain it, resonated with anxieties of the era. The film's refusal to assign blame or offer solutions heightened this resonance. There is no scientist delivering answers, no authority figure restoring order. the world simply absorbs the catastrophe and keeps moving. Ironically, the director never intended a philosophical statement. He later revealed that technical issues ruined the exposition scenes, forcing him to embrace ambiguity out of necessity. Yet, this enforced vagueness transformed the film's conclusion into one of its most memorable elements. The ending lingers because it withholds explanation, reflecting a truth viewers instinctively recognize: some disasters unfold too quietly for easy interpretation. By refusing to comfort its audience, The Children ensures its final note is not relief, but dread, the fear that the real story is only beginning. Fact 20. The cult reputation built from imperfections. After its complicated release, The Children seemed destined to fade into obscurity, overshadowed by larger and more polished horror titles. Instead, the film found a strange second life through poor-quality VHS transfers and midnight screenings. Bootleg copies circulated widely, often marked by warped audio, faded colors, and jittery tracking lines. These flaws inadvertently amplified the movie's unsettling atmosphere, giving viewers the impression they were watching something degraded, contaminated, an artifact that had survived a disaster rather than a standard production. As the film aged, critics began re-evaluating its thematic ambition. Its portrayal of ecological paranoia, generational breakdown, and institutional incompetence resonated more strongly than when it premiered. Scholars argued that the very imperfections that once undermined the film had become integral to its appeal. The warped lens, the yellow discoloration, the unstable sound recording. Each flaw contributed to a sense of instability, mirroring the narrative's moral and environmental decay. Restoration teams later faced a dilemma: remove these defects and risk sanitizing the film's character, or preserve them as historical texture. They ultimately chose preservation, acknowledging that the technical anomalies had become inseparable from its legacy. Meanwhile, fans treated the film like a buried relic. Horror festivals championed it as a lost gem. Online communities dissected its themes, arguing that its low-budget origins allowed it to explore taboos mainstream films avoided. What once seemed a minor exploitation picture transformed into a cultural artifact shaped by accident, controversy, and time. The Children endured not because it was flawless, but because its flaws created an aura of authenticity, a feeling that the movie itself had been touched by the contamination it depicted. In embracing its imperfections, the film became something singular, a cinematic anomaly that refuses to be forgotten. Bonus fact: the sequel, conceived in silence but doomed by circumstance, long before The Children developed the reputation it holds today, a small circle of producers quietly nurtured plans for a follow-up. Unlike the first film, which unfolded in a contained rural town, the proposed sequel expanded the contamination into a national crisis. Early outlines describe a world in which subtle behavioral shifts in newborns signaled the beginning of a generational unraveling. The infection would no longer manifest as violence alone, but as a creeping transformation that adults could not interpret, let alone control. Writers envisioned a narrative built on rising paranoia, parents watching their infants for the slightest irregularity, communities fracturing under mistrust, and government agencies debating whether the outbreak required containment or denial. Yet even at its most conceptual stage, the project was troubled. Rights disputes carried over from the first film left ownership unclear. Without legal certainty, investors refused to commit funding. Several actors, particularly those who had portrayed surviving adults, declined to participate, believing the first film's controversy had overshadowed its artistic intentions. Insurance representatives complicated matters further. The presence of infants and children in horror settings triggered heightened scrutiny and steep premiums the production could not afford. But the obstacle that ultimately halted progress came from the director himself. After reflecting on the original film's impact, he expressed deep reluctance to continue a story built on such a provocative premise. He believed the power of The Children lay in suggestion, in the lingering implications of its final scene. Extending the narrative risked reducing mystery to exposition. According to crew accounts, the director argued that the horror worked precisely because the audience never saw the infection spread. It existed at the edge of understanding, where dread thrives. With no unified vision and no financial backing, the sequel dissolved quietly. Only fragments remain: a few pages of notes, sketches of infected infants, and a title scrawled in pencil on a margin. The unrealized sequel now exists as a ghost of possibility, a haunting reminder that some stories draw their strength from what they refuse to continue. What lingers after The Children ends isn't the violence, but the questions it refuses to resolve. The film leaves a residue of unease, a sense that contamination can spread in silence long before anyone recognizes its shape. Tell us in the comments which moment reshaped your understanding of the story, and whether you think the film's terror comes from science, symbolism, or something more elusive. If you want more deep explorations into forgotten films that challenge their own boundaries, subscribe and share the next title you want uncovered.